Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons, the 13th episode of the second season of Gravity Falls. I was hoping, just based on the title of this episode, that it was going to be a parody of Dungeons & Dragons, and I was not disappointed in the slightest. The plot goes that Ford is living a completely separate life from the rest of the Pineses. He has made himself completely at home in the basement of the Mystery Shack, and while Dipper, who still idolizes him as the author, wants to become involved in his life, Ford insists that he can't, for, as he explains, he walks a lonely road, and it's the only road that he has ever known, or something like that. And, of course, Stan and Mabel insist that Dipper belongs with them. He's part of their family. But later, when Dipper picks up a copy of Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons, this world's XP for Dungeons & Dragons at the local store, when he explains to everyone what it is and how much math it uses, particularly, they were particularly annoyed with how much math it used. They refused to not only give it a try, but they were actually really hard on him for liking it. Even Seuss, who's into LARP, was pretty hard on him for liking it. A little harder than I would have expected on him, but that's alright, it wasn't that big a deal. And it did further the plot. You need at least 2 people to play, even a solo campaign, because somebody has to DM. So as Dipper searches for someone to play with him, and ends up trying to play with the goat, of all people, he accidentally drops his dice down into one of the cracks opened in the Mystery Shack by the events at the end of Not What He Seems. And when he goes down to retrieve the dice, he bumps into Ford. Ford is, at first, very upset to see him down there since he told him to stay out. But when he realizes what Dipper's doing, the two of them start playing the game together. Turns out Ford is also a big fan. And they start bonding over the game, and it was really nice to see the two of them getting along. I know Ford was just introduced to the show, but he's already a lot like Dipper. A lot like how I could imagine Dipper ending up as he gets older. And so it was just really nice to see the two of them playing nice together. And Dipper immediately starts to feel more at home with Ford than he does with the others, at least at this point in time. Ford ends up showing Dipper an infinity-sided dice, something that he picked up during his time in other dimensions, that literally has infinite sides and can manifest whatever its role ends up being. And since its role can be literally anything that you can imagine, it can manifest literally anything you can imagine. It is accidentally rolled, and it ends up bringing the antagonist of Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons, Probabilitor the Wizard, and his minions to life. Probabilitor snatches up Dipper and Ford and takes them away into the forest, and immediately Stan and Mabel and Grenda, who is there for something completely unrelated, take up a quest to go and retrieve them. Stan and Mabel specifically end up having to compete against Probabilitor in a Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons battle, with Ford and Dipper acting as their characters in the game world. And at first they're stuck. They don't understand what they're doing until they learn that Dungeons, Dungeons, and More Dungeons is also about imagination. The two of them, being very imaginative people, defeat Probabilitor very, very easily, rescue their family, and everything is good again. For now, at least. Because we do get a scene at the very, very end, where we see that Ford has started to trust Dipper more and reveals to him that the portal, using the portal, which has now been dismantled, by the way, created a sort of dimensional instability. And while Ford does explain to Dipper, and therefore to us, because at this point at least Ford is not yet a viewpoint character, while he does explain that he has contained the instability, it's still there and it's still dangerous, which is kind of concerning. And let me just say, this episode was absolutely ridiculous. Like, balls to the walls. Insano crazy. Like, there was some good character stuff in here, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to downplay the genuine and serious moments of this episode at all. It's just that they were mixed in with so many crazy plot points and crazy visuals. The infinity-sided dice, first of all, was the supernatural element of this particular story, and it was really underplayed here, and I felt like the result of its role was incredibly boring, considering that it could have done literally anything. Like, did the role that it landed on specifically bring a fictional character in its vicinity to life, or did it land on a value that specifically brought Probabilitor to life? I don't know, it just felt too on the nose for what was going on in the story already. But that's not to say that it was bad. Seeing this universe's version of Dungeons & Dragons was very interesting to me. I am a huge fan of Dungeons & Dragons. I played a lot with my friends years ago. And in fact, me and the same two friends could probably sit down and continue the game that we were playing back then, right now, assuming that we found the time to do so. And there is a cool little message here about how nerdy hobbies like Dungeons & Dragons might also have value to people who don't consider themselves nerdy. That just because you think something isn't for you doesn't mean you shouldn't give it a try. And it even had a little bit of a message about acceptance. They were all really hard on Dipper for liking D&D, when by the end they ended up liking it themselves. It was cool to see all of that in there and all really underplayed for the viewer to pick out themselves. And it was neat to see a lot of commentary on Dungeons & Dragons specifically. They really overplayed the amount of math that's involved, and they really overplayed the amount of imagination that's involved. Real Dungeons & Dragons kind of meets in the middle, but all of the points that they made about the game still stand. It felt kind of like in the second compilation episode, the short episode about animation, how they kind of dug at animation but also showed how great it could be. It felt kind of like that, just in a longer episode format. They took plenty of digs at Dungeons & Dragons, and especially some of the dumb things that the creators of Dungeons & Dragons have done in the past, but they also showed how fun and how great the game can be. And as a fan of the game, I really appreciated that. It was also good to see immediately after Ford's introduction to the show, and immediately after Ford was used as effectively a plot device to save everyone, that he's not going to fall into that role every single week. Here, he's the one who ends up having to be saved. It also showed us that Dipper is gravitating more towards Ford, whereas Mabel is gravitating more towards Stan, which I think could open up some really interesting plot possibilities in the future, so I'm looking forward to seeing where that goes. Overall, I wouldn't say this is one of the great episodes of the show, but it certainly wasn't bad, and I did enjoy watching it. But as per usual, guys, I'd like to ask, what did you think of this episode if you have seen it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.